Welcome back to the 238th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, both of which include and talk about the issue of homelessness. One of them is about the Supreme Court taking on a very important case that could define how homelessness prospers or falters in major cities, or the different approach to tackling the housing crisis. And both of these come from different perspectives, so we'll be jumping into them. There's only two today. I'm doing some pre-recording episodes. It should be about the same amount of time as always, but we're going to go on a little bit more of a deep dive on this particular issue. And of course, we'll still end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, should it be legal for you to live on the sidewalk? Should it be legal for you to live on any public sidewalk, as long as it is not private property? So, in theory, if you've paid into that system most of your life, whether it be income tax, whether it be taxes that you paid to the state, and you're saying, nope, this is public property, I have in some way partially paid for this, even just my labor has contributed to this economy, therefore I should have the right to stay here on this sidewalk. Or any argument you can very well think of, human compassion, whatever argument you have, I want to hear it. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Do you have the right? Do you not necessarily have the right, but should we allow it? Come on, give me all your different arguments, because I'd love to hear where everybody's coming from. And with the deep dive that we're doing, we're definitely going to take on a few different perspectives. And I think that mine's going to be the unpopular one, but hey, it is what it is. So let's jump to our first article that comes from the New York Post. The headline reads, "The Supreme Court could soon outlaw homeless camps." So when it was first talked about this was going to go to the Supreme Court. People who were on the more left-hand side of the aisle were saying, whoa, hey, they're going to take away this fundamental right from people. I even did a story about it, and I think it was one of the final stories where things that, they're coming up, they're not necessarily there yet. It's just a cursory thing. It's on the periphery of the conversation at this point, and it may become important. That's normally what the third segment is left there for. It was one of those things that I briefly touched on, and now it's coming back, and it's a serious case that the left is saying, hey, we need to worry, or at least we need to be concerned with the possibility of this right-wing court taking it up and saying that people, they don't have a right to live in tents on the street, and that cities can, if they choose, they can ban homeless encampments. And see, the interesting thing here is it's not a issue where it's people coming to the government and saying, hey, this is an issue, they're outside our private property, or even they're on the public property and it somehow infringes our rights as other citizens. No, this is actually a city jurisdiction that the case started with, and it went in to the appellate court in the area, and now it's made its all the way up to the Supreme Court. But before I bungle any more of the details, let's just read you one of the first paragraphs from the article. Quote, "Homeless encampments like the ones in Seattle could become a thing of the past, as the Supreme Court is soon to decide their fate. The Supreme Court will soon take up Grants Pass versus Johnson, one of the highest profile cases this term. Grants Pass is a Oregon city whose laws aimed at restricting street homelessness were struck down by the San Francisco-based Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals." So, obviously, the area that we're talking about here is pretty darn liberal. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because there are advocates for more homeless protection from both sides of the aisle, whether it be people that are on the right or on the left. They may have different approaches to doing it, but there still are advocates on both sides. And some of those advocates may be on different sides of other political issues, but they agree on this one. So it doesn't have to be a right or left issue, but there are definitely trends in more right leaning areas, there are stricter policies against homelessness, whether that be because of aesthetics or the idea that it breeds more drug use or it brings more criminal elements into their community. There are lots of different justifications that are given, but that is why a lot of right-wing places crack down. A lot of left-wing places argue that we should have the compassion. These people should be allowed to be here. It is not necessarily their fault that they are homeless, which, in some instances, it really isn't it isn't their fault. Sometimes it really isn't somebody's fault. They hit some bad luck. They get kicked out for one reason or another that's not solely on them. But a lot of the time, it could have been prevented. There are certain things that are at play. It's not just the world going about and crushing somebody and society crushing them. There are certain actions that lead up to it that could have prevented it. So that's why that argument of empathy sometimes falls on deaf ears, but not on the West Coast in these liberal cities. And when you hear that the circuit court is based out of San Fran, one of the most permissive states, San Fran, one of the most permissive cities in one of the most permissive states when it comes to homelessness law, you're not surprised. What was surprising to me was that this was coming out of Oregon. Actually, one of the cities was like, no, okay, we're not gonna hold the line on this one. We want to be able to enforce our own bans on homeless encampments. So obviously, this court that's this lower the court, the circuit court here in California, they're just like, no, you kind of got to just keep them around. You actually don't have the right to enforce this sort of thing. It's public land. You can't just force people out. There are a few different actual justifications. And if you want to hear about some of those more detailed arguments, you can go back to the previous article where we cover this. I believe it was somewhere around episode 210, maybe 205, somewhere around there. But it's interesting nonetheless, because in this area that is very permissive, you have a juxtaposition, and this is how a lot of changes come. Like, there may be a city that it has a population that is much more permissive towards bringing illegal immigrants into a certain area, and the state and the surrounding states may be a little bit more, how should I say, hardened to the issue. They are very strict. And that city is basically a springboard because their policies will be a little bit different. They will go up into a court of appeals that probably reflects the broader area a little bit more. And they can actually springboard this issue up to the Supreme Court. So people on the Republican side are like, oh yeah, hey, this is our opportunity to take on this big issue or at least get a judgment on it. And people on the left are saying, whoa, no, hey, Supreme Court, this is not something that you need to deal with. And I'll be honest with you, they're not going to be able to make a prescription. We've been over this before with how the Supreme Court actually works. They're probably going to say, no, actually, it is unconstitutional for there to be a ban on certain types of policies, and certain cities can actually put up this sort of legislation unless it is outlawed within their state, and even then, that law could be brought up to the Supreme Court and could be ruled whether or not that it is legal or not, or within the constitutional purview, so to speak. And then something would have to be passed by the legislator of the United States on the federal level. So this is how it's probably going to end up going, but no one's ever going to want to put in all that extra effort. So if the Supreme Court does something, for the most part, it's going to stand for at least 15 years. That's a rough estimate, so to speak. So you can see why some people will be very, very frustrated that this issue is actually being brought up, because they feel as though the homelessness issue is actually a great pressure point or a great leverage point to advocate for things like guaranteed housing or more housing programs or more federal or state involvement in city jurisdictions and taking tax revenues in order to create more housing projects or even just affordable housing. And this is something that the states in the West Coast, especially California, have been pushing for quite some time. It's not their only leverage point because, yes, the markets in a lot of places in California, it's very expensive to buy a home. So that's leverage enough by itself. But then also when you can dangle that cherry, say, hey, look at all these homeless people we have, we can actually use that, the advocates can use that as justification to say, hey, this is another reason that we need more affordable housing, and they can continue to press the government on these issues. And the reason I think this is extremely important to some people on the left is because they really have this mentality that there is a universal human right to shelter or housing. I say shelter because I think they would want to be able to derive it in natural law or natural rights, kind of under a Lockean framework, if they were going to try to make this actually like a legal argument rather. And I don't think that's necessarily true. You have a right to shelter that you build. You do not have the right to shelter built by somebody else, aka the right to somebody else's labor. But at the end of the day, that's probably one of the main arguments underlying a lot of this. And you've heard this talking points a lot. Oh, housing is a human right. And this is sort of the conversation that's been evolving. I mean, you've heard Bernie Sanders talk about this. He's been pushing it for quite some time. You've seen policies just like this coming out of California that's been pushing this for quite some time. So I think homelessness and the genuine problem of homelessness, the images of it, but also the way it affects communities, it can actually push people to say, hey, I don't want to see these homeless people in our communities. It breaks my heart. I don't want to see anybody hurt themselves with drugs. I don't want my kids to be around that. So sure, I'll give a little bit of my extra tax dollars in order to build more housing. And also it's the more empathetic thing to do. I think all of those factors are there. I don't necessarily think it is malicious, but my point being, it is a very handy political tool when also trying to push this agenda of human rights, including on a natural level before the existence of government, housing. So if that's the presupposition that you're coming from, you can see why they would be frustrated when this case is going to come up in front of the Supreme Court. Quote, the Ninth Circuit decided Boise, and this is one of the precedents that they're challenging, which concerned restrictions on public camping similar to those in the issue in Grant Pass back in 2018. Its core findings was that Boise, Idaho could not enforce a blanket ban on public camping unless it had first made shelter beds available to its entire unsheltered population. So basically, you can't just remove somebody from where they're living currently without having some sort of guarantee as to where they would have to go. Yeah, it's a pretty solid argument, at least on a empathy level. It doesn't always work out that way when you're trying to clear a certain location. You're not always going to have enough beds for these people, and that shouldn't have to be a restriction, because what happens when you have an influx of 1,000 people who notice that this policy is in place, and they're saying, oh, well, the likelihood, they only have 100 beds, so the likelihood that I actually get taken off the street put into a bed is like 1 in 100, and it's unethical to do it otherwise. So there's going to be lots of pushback, and they won't actually get rid of these encampments because they won't have beds for them. So you can see that logic there, what I was saying. You could see why people would take the risk of coming to these locations, and you can see how the policy, or at least the decision, incentivizes more people to come to these locations because they know that they can't actually knock down all of the camps unless they have enough beds for everybody. And then, even if they do get forced out, they get a nice bed. And the likelihood that they get forced out is pretty low if there's a large population, if you see where I'm coming from. Maybe they're not thinking in math terms. Maybe they're not sitting there with the calculator like, okay, well, I noticed that Jimmy and John came in today. That's an extra 2 people, which means my odds of getting picked out actually went down by 0.002%. Yeah, I like those odds. I'll stay here for a while. They're not actually doing the math like that, but it is common sense. Oh, there's more of us. They can't clear out all of us. Therefore, I'll more than likely be able to stay where I am. So you can see how that policy is actually very, very restrictive. Even if it is humane, it puts a lot of shackles and cuffs on these different cities. So that is why Grants Pass is challenging it. Quote, and they did it underneath the 8th Amendment, and this is the objection that the New York Post and the new lawyers that are arguing this case specifically are trying to push back on. Quote, traditionally, the function of the 8th Amendment has been to ensure that severe methods of punishment, such as the medieval torture known as breaking someone on the wheel, had no place in American criminal justice practices. So basically, they put it underneath the Eighth Amendment and say, hey, this is cruel and unusual punishment for something. And then my question is, wait, hold on. So are they going to trial and then being given a punishment because of that? No, they're not. These people who are living on the streets aren't being taken in and then being tried by a jury of their peers and then being given an unjust punishment. They're just being asked to move along. That's very different. It's not cruel and unusual punishment because it is not actually administered by the justice system that's supposed to protect their rights or at least confine them if they break somebody else's rights in the first place. It's just a simple thing of, hey, you're not allowed to be here, move along. We're not saying that you're doing anything terrible. We're not going to put you in jail for doing it. We're not just trying to be absolutely outright cruel and send you to a place in a random part of the state for 25 years to serve a sentence for this one thing that may genuinely be out of your control for a little bit, but we still want to enable a prospering community. We don't want to have any of these terrible things within the sight of our families, of our kids. We don't want them to believe it's socially acceptable, the possibility of needles being out there. There are lots of justifications on both sides, and I find the argument of the Eighth Amendment kind of idiotic because the whole point about cruel and unusual punishment is in terms of how you are forced to serve out your sentence after actually being criminally tried. They're not being criminally tried for being in a place illegally. They're just being asked to move out of that place for being there illegally. They're not having to go to court for it. So therefore, how could you even argue that it's cruel and unusual punishment? Then again, I guess sometimes you can get fines that you don't have to go to court for, and some people would say, oh, it's an excessive charge, it's cruel and unusual punishment. I'm sure there's a nice way to finagle it for sure. I just think it's a pretty stupid way to actually go about this one, rather than just talking about the fundamental rights of people to be on the land that they pay for. And if these people are homeless and they're genuinely going to work and they're coming back and living on this public land, they're still paying taxes to the city. I think there would be an even better argument actually to say, no, this actually is public land. I should be able to be here because my tax dollars are going towards this. I think you could have, I'm not saying it's a 100% solid argument. I'm saying you could have more of an argument if you took that tack rather than the Eighth Amendment tack, which I don't think will hold up, especially when it's going to the Supreme Court this term. But let's be clear, we have our people who don't want to see these homeless encampments go. They see it as cruel in order to break them up. They see it as taking away some of the last options that people have. And I'll speak from the heart right now, which is, one, I've seen some of these in person, not some of the worst ones, no doubt about that, but I've been around a few different cities over the course of the last few years, and I've seen some of the way that these people live, and it is sad. It breaks my heart. And then there's also a personal story. There's someone close to me who is currently living on the streets of one of these big cities on the West Coast, and I didn't get to actually see this person, but I was told about what's going on in their life, and they felt as though they were not ready to come back and actually live or come back and deal with certain aspects of I don't want to say the real world, but they were not ready. They wanted to stay where they are currently. And I'm not saying that's because, oh, it's great and amazing, but there is some sort of allure there. There's some sort of culture there. And if you allow these different tent cities, these different camping or illegal camping groups to stay and prosper, they create their own culture, people that are down on their luck that don't want to or can't necessarily get out of it. Or I take that back. It's not that they can't. It's just that the circumstances are so hard that they get dragged down, and they'd rather stay there with a community where it's hard, but at least they're in it together. Then you're basically encouraging this behavior rather than breaking it up, saying, no, okay, hey, we'll find you a bed at this place, but you can only stay in this bed if you keep looking for jobs, and we'll try to provide you, we'll take you to the closest Goodwill, we'll take you to a thrift shop, and we'll try to get you a semi-decent suit to get a job so then you can have a little bit more money to buy an even better suit. And these sort of practices where we encourage people to actually pick themselves up rather than stay sitting in the filth that they exist in. I think one policy, breaking up the camps, does that more than the other policy. of trying to be compassionate in allowing these camps to stay and providing drug overdose medication. And yes, while these camps exist, that is a very worthwhile solution. Going through having social agents who work in those areas who bring Narcan and other things to actually relieve the pain that these people are in. Yes, that is a practical solution for solving it how it is, but it is not a practical solution for solving it into the future. And just providing them free housing is also not one of them, because guess what? They're going to just be given something else. No, they got to work for it. They got to be invested in it. They have to feel as though this is my property. Not just it was given to me by the government. It could, in theory, be taken away. No, this is my hard work for property. I busted my tail to get out of that terrible situation. Do you know how much pride there is in that idea? Hey, I work for a living. I pay for the place that I live in. That's a very, very strong feeling. I can't imagine what it's like for somebody who picked themselves off of the ground out of a tent city, literally, and had a rags to riches story, or at least a rags to respectable story. The pride that you could take in that. Maybe I'm just a prideful person, and maybe I'm just, I don't like relying on other people. Maybe that's my disposition, but I feel as though that's something empowering, and I feel like that's something we could talk about a lot more rather than we have to purely and only be empathetic. So what's the other solution? What's the other side of this? And this article comes from Real Clear Politics on housing. Trickle-down Democrats have failed Americans in need. And they take this side of the argument that, hey, housing is a human right, so on and so forth. Actually, I don't want to just breeze through this one, because the other one, I've talked about it a little bit before. I think there's more grand arguments to be had here. I think this specific article is trying to address a very, I don't want to say specific again, but they are taking a very targeted approach to certain policies in California. Quote, Democrats once mocked Ronald Reagan's trickle-down theory that if you showered privileges on the super rich, it would trickle down to the underprivileged. But what did they actually learn from the Reagan era? While trickle-down Democrats sound different than Reagan, they have a whole lot in common. The belief in the supernatural power of the marketplace to solve all problems is based on the false premise that unregulated capitalism meets human needs rather than extracting profit for the privileged class. While I don't 100% agree with where they're coming from, and I'm not saying there isn't some trickle-down effect, what they're getting at here is that they're trying to indict the Democrats on having the exact same mentality for a different issue within their area. And my thing is, I don't actually agree with why they're indicting them for the system, because they're saying, oh, well, no, they're not doing this particular system right. I'm saying they shouldn't be doing this policy or the system that they're talking about at all, in my opinion. But I'm trying to give the author's perspective here. That's why we're getting such a loathsome criticism of how the Democrats are operating within California. Quote, the failure to house California's population is the most glaring example of trickle-down economics gone wrong. Rather than regulating rents, they keep increasing. Newsom has fought tooth and nail against rent control. Instead of requiring developers to include truly affordable units in their mega projects, they have been granted a king's ransom in government incentives and exemptions. Even this giant wealth transfer isn't enough. California taxpayers also have shelled out tens of billions to the affordable housing industry complex that has been wasted on stopgap band-aids or 1 per million apartment boondoggles. The result, the greatest homelessness crisis since the Great Depression. And let's take a step back. So we understand that, and I mentioned at the very beginning, some of the prices in California are absolutely outrageous. Where are they trying to build most of this affordable housing? Let me ask that question. Where are they trying to do it? Where the population of the homeless camps are right now. So you actually see a lot of affordable housing projects going up in major cities. Great. Okay. Why? Why would you put it there? Well, there's increased opportunity because if you're in the city, there's more potential for jobs. So that's one logical reason to build those projects there. It's close to people and social workers that can actually help out these communities. There's going to be more of them in the city. So I guess you could see that argument. But then I have a counter question. Why not build them 50, 100 miles away in different cities? Why not build them in more rural areas and say, hey, we're going to take you out here. This rural economy needs a little bit of help too. It's going to be a lot cheaper to build these affordable housing units out here. Sorry, you may have to commute in a little bit, but you'll be saving on costs in order to get into certain locations. Oh, wait, no, because that doesn't feel like they're addressing the issue. That is politically disadvantageous because they're sending it to another county, which one would need county to county interaction. If you have one in LA County, I'm pretty sure there's four counties, or at least four separate voting districts in LA. So you would need at least cooperation across multiple counties in order to make this work. But if you want to take a statewide approach, that's one way to do it. But no, for some reason, they have to take really expensive land in these cities and do it there. So maybe what they're actually trying to do is pretend that they're fixing the issue and trying to make it look like they care, but really they're just trying to appropriate land and bring down the cost of everything. Or, am I crazy? Am I crazy there? Maybe just a little bit. Maybe there's something about just saying that they want to live, or people just saying, oh yeah, I live in LA. Maybe there's something about that makes people really excited. But once again, my question becomes, if we're trying to solve the homelessness issue, or we're trying to solve this need for housing, why not build houses further out and then people can commute in if their jobs are based in LA? I understand that traffic is absolutely terrible there, but why is putting on caps, why is saying that renting caps are going to be the solution? Because the author clearly states that they need to have a cap on the price, or not necessarily a cap on all the prices of different apartments, but hey, you get an apartment and then you are not going to have to pay a rent increase every single year when you renew the lease. It is capped at the price that you started renting it at. That's an interesting argument. What happens to that landlord? What happens if it's a small landlord? And let's put it this way. I understand if it's a big landlord, you can make an argument about, well, hey, the big landlord can actually absorb cost. So, and if you don't like big corporations, sure, that argument could work for a little bit. It won't work forever if every single rent is capped. But sure, if we're going to go that route, fine. Temporary solution. I don't think it's the best, but on a practical scale, maybe you can let it go. What about the small renter, though? What about the person whose grandfather, before LA really bounced off, and there was a little exurb, bought up 2 or 3 plots of land, built up a nice little apartment there, they pass it down through the family, and then they get screwed because there's caps on the rent, even though the more apartment buildings are going up around them, more houses are going there, the school system's better, blah, 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 blah. They would want to actually increase the prices in order to compete with other people within the area, and they're trying to bring in a more high-priced clientele, but no, there's 1 or 2 people who are rent locked, they're rent capped, and they're not going to leave because they're only paying maybe half or 75% of what everybody else in the area is paying because the price has gone up. Then that person's missing out. The landlord is missing out on opportunity. They're missing out on the ability to get the most for their property, and eventually they're going to have to sell their apartment because they're not making what they should, and then a mega corporation is going to come in and just buy them up. So it does bad things to small landlords. And guess what? A lot of landlords in the United States, except for the big transfer that happened during COVID, a lot of them are still small business owners, or just singular entrepreneurs. So yes, I understand where you're coming from. This idea that, oh yeah, we're just gonna leave it up to the market and that's gonna solve everything. I understand where you have frustrations with that, but let me ask you this: a lot of the problem is not necessarily based on just leaving it up to the free market. Which state has created the most public housing projects within its state on the West Coast? California. That's because they have a large population. Look at places like Oakland. Look at places like Los Angeles. Look at places which I was going to say San Francisco, but technically Oakland was the projects there for a little bit in San Francisco. Look at places like San Jose. Their problems aren't as bad, but you still see some of them. There's been a lot of government subsidized housing that has gone to a particular subsect of the economy, a lower end. It's been designated for the working class, and it hasn't necessarily worked out because it's a direct intervention by the government into the market. They're basically providing or building this housing at a subsidized rate, meaning that those builders are getting paid more for their work and their effort, and it's just being subsidized by the government. So the government can just keep on saying, oh, well, we'll just raise taxes. We'll just keep pulling this money out of our butt, and we will just, pay them so they can run a little bit higher costs. They can run into a few more issues. And guess what? Because it's a public project, it's not an actual project that has to meet all of its goals and deadlines and its budget as much, because it's for the sake of the community. It's for the public good. So no, we can't just default on this project versus a private company that if they default on the project and they're not able to recoup from either selling the housing apartment that they just made or from the rents that they make from it, that apartment goes under, while the public housing, the subsidized one, the one that the government's helping pay for, if not paying for all of it, guess what? They can run up the cost as much as they want and still get paid for their work. So that's a direct intervention in the market. So no, it's not actually a free market system, because you have the government coming in and subsidizing this type of housing that's undercutting the rest of the market. So, your solution is, we're undercutting the market on one end, but also we need to cap the market on another. Oh, come on. Is that really going to be a solution? I want to have an actual long sit down, because let's be clear, I do not know California housing policy as much as this person may actually know it. I've read multiple books about red line policies, and the different way that these different cities were segregated and how the housing was broken up between those. Read a lot of different statistics or a lot of different articles about the current projects and how they have to be green efficient and how that's an extra cost that certain builders aren't willing or unable to actually take on unless they get more government subsidies. I've read a lot, but that doesn't mean I understand everything. So I would love to talk to this author, and I would love for somebody to come in and explain to me why I am so absolutely wrong and provide me all the evidence from the various different accounts of the California real estate market and the affordable housing market in California. But I will tell you now, putting caps on the rent is not going to help the average person. It's going to help the really crappy people that you don't want in your apartment. And you can't kick them out, because as long as they pay that minimum amount and they're not trying to prosper, they're not trying to get more money, they're not trying to move out of the apartment, they're not trying to use the apartment as a stopgap, they're just trying to use it as a permanent place to live. And let's be clear, I understand everybody's financial situation is different, but at the end of the day, if it's capped and the value of the neighborhood goes up around them, then that landlord is losing out. And I would rather allow that small landlord to increase rents and kick somebody out and be unempathetic to that one person who is doing less for the economy than that other person who is a business owner and doing more for the economy. How many different units in different places and different domestic or domiciles is that landlord providing? 10, 18, 20 different domiciles? I don't know how to pronounce that properly. Versus that one person who, no, they're actually not providing any housing to anybody. They're adding less value to the economy, if you want to look at it that way, if you want to be cold and calculating. So, sorry, I got off on a really long rant there. My phone, which I have been using instead of my iPad, actually turned off because I ranted too long and I didn't actually touch it for a while. So, it is what it is. So let's jump to our daily delight. We're going to end on a positive note, all that negative stuff out of the way. This one comes from Parade Pets. Shih Tzu does the cutest little strut upon meeting another dog just like him. And one of the theses of the articles, or one of the things they're discussing, is, can dogs actually recognize dogs of their own breed? The author is kind of back and forth. They say no, but then again, some dog owners say yes, they definitely can. So I don't know. Tell me what you think. Does your dog, if you have one, recognize another? If your dog's a German Shepherd, does it recognize another German Shepherd? I'll tell you now, my dog didn't really care when I had one. She was like, hey, you're a dog. Okay, you're not a cat? Cool, we're not going to get into a fight. You're a cat? Hey, get off my land kind of deal. But that's enough on that one. If you want to see any of the cute photos from this article, you want to read it, or you want to read any of today's articles, there will be a link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.